This October I wanted to make something special, so I decided to make a completely scratch-built Gorkanaut using some toys, some trash I've collected over the years, and some other bits and bobs I had laying around. To start, I cut up the toys. This went quite smoothly for the most part as the plastic wasn't too hard. However, some of the parts of these toys were quite hard to pull apart, like the wheels on the blue toy. I then cut a square piece of foam board to size to make a base, and I rounded over the edges to get a nice oval shape. And I made sure to save these offcuts for later because we'll need them for another part of the project. Whenever you glue plastic like this to something else, make sure to really scratch or scuff up the surface to give the glue more surface area to stick to. After gluing the yellow toy to the base, I decided to add some detail using this engine looking thing I got off from the blue toy. To be able to glue it in place, I had to cut off most of the roof from the yellow toy, and I saved most of the scraps I cut off, which I could maybe use later. To make sure these pieces would stick together, I scuffed off the surface of the pieces I'd glued together using super glue. I thought this part of the blue toy really looked like the bottom of a head, so I decided I wanted to glue it in place of the cabin on the yellow toy and use it as the base of the head. However, doing this would create a big ugly void between the engine part and this blue head looking thing, so to cover up the space and add some nice detail, I cut up this cap from a tube of wall filler and glued it over the connecting points. And again, any of the parts I cut off from the cap I saved for later as I could use these as nice panels on the rest of the body. I wanted the armor of the Gorkanaut to cover part of the tracks, and I also wanted to create a bit of a wedge shape like the original Gorkanaut from Games Workshop has. So in order to have something to glue these panels to, I created a frame using some bamboo coffee stirrers. Because the Gorkanaut is also a transport model, I wanted to create some sort of a hatch at the back of the model through which orcs could enter and exit the Gorkanaut. So for this I used part of the roof which I cut off earlier because I thought it really looked like a hedge. After removing the wheels from the yellow toy, there are now two holes in the tracks of the yellow toy. So in order to cover these up, I used some cardstock. To get the correct shape, I simply used the wheels I removed earlier and used these as a template, and I cut these pieces to shape and glued them in place. And I also added some nice things to add some more detail, like this red ring which is just a seal from a spray can. While covering these holes, I almost got some super glue on the base, which isn't good because super glue melts foam. So I decided to protect the base by covering it in a thin layer of glue. The base will get covered in some texture later, however this will just protect it for now in case I make a mistake and drop some super glue on it. I then covered the entire body in some panels using cardstock, some of the scraps I had left over from cutting up the cap for example, and I also used this awesome looking textured cardboard. I thought it had a nice texture which looked like some sort of beaten metal, and I would probably paint it in some sort of a brass color. I also glued on some other parts like this yellow wheel which I will use as an arm joint for the arm I'll glue on later, and I also cut up these piston looking things which I pulled off from the front of the yellow toy, and I glued one part of it to the other side of the model just to add some nice detail and variation. To fill up the void at the back of the head, I decided to use some straws which I cut up to make it look like a bunch of pipes are sticking out. This will not only cover up the hole, but also add some nice detail. To block out the rest of the shape of the head, I used some styrofoam, which I simply cut into a nice shape and then covered with a bunch of cardstock. To add some interest to the face, I created some eyes using this red ring, some cardstock and some other bits I had laying around. And now to add even more detail, I'll get some bits from my bits box and glue them to this model. You obviously don't need to do this, and you could probably create some of these texture details yourself. However, like most of you, I just had them laying around in my bits box, so why not use them? To create the Death Storm Mega Shooter, I used this arm from the blue toy and I glued some straws to it. I had this big straw which is the exact correct size to fit in 7 of these smaller straws, really making it look like a bunch of barrels. I cut up 3 of these pieces in varying lengths and glued them inside of the arm. I then covered some of the voids using some cardstock and glued this arm to the body. To create the claw of Gork, I simply used the arms from the yellow toy and glued them together. I thought it was slightly too long, so I cut off a piece of it, and I then used the foam board scraps I saved from earlier and cut them up into some claw looking shapes, and I glued them to the arm. Again, don't use super glue for this, it will melt the foam. Most of these big orc vehicles will have a big jaw with some nasty looking teeth, so I also wanted to add this to my model. And to do this I used one of the scoops from the blue toy. I cut off some of the pieces to make sure it fit, glued it in place and used some coffee stirrers to create some nice supports. I then also glued 2 pointy pieces of cardstock to the corners of this jaw to really make it look like he had pointy teeth. To create some texture on the base, I used a mixture of speckle, a a tiny bit of water, some sand and some brown ink. The brown ink is used to color the speckle, so in case it ever chips there isn't a white part on the base sticking out. And while the speckle on the base and the glue on the model were drying, I put it aside and I started to clean my desk, because at this point it was a complete mess. And now that the speckle and the glue on the model is dry, my desk is all cleaned up, I'll use some cheap black spray primer to prime the model. At first it just looked like a bunch of trash glued together, which it kinda is, but now it's actually starting to look like a proper Ork model. So to start off the painting, I used a very heavy dry brush of some gunmetal and covered the entire model. I then painted some select areas like the textured cardboard using some brass scorpion. While these metallics dry, I'm gonna paint the base using 3 different colors of brown. I simply wet blended these together to get some nice variation in the color of the base. And now I'm gonna add some color to the body of the Gorkanaut. I used a bunch of colors like red, blue and green and stippled these onto the panels. I tried to avoid the edges of the panels to really make them look weathered and damaged. I then also stippled on some burnt armor with a bigger brush to create some dirty looking spots on the model. I mainly focused this on the lower part of the body as this would most likely get the most dirt on it. I promise, we're almost done. I then covered the entire model in some acrylic streaking grime, but you could also use a black or brown homemade wash for this. I removed all the excess using a crop top piece of toilet paper, which also creates a nice texture and removes any of the pooling. I then added even more weathering using some dirty down rust, dirty down moss and dirty down verdigris effect. And I sealed this afterwards using some spray varnish to make sure it doesn't get reactivated if it ever gets wet. And then, to lighten everything up a bit, I dry brushed the entire model using some AK Interactive Natural Steel. And I also brought back some of the texture on the base by dry brushing it using some Vallejo Khaki. And now, let's have a look at the result. If you liked how this Gorkanaut turned out, be sure to let me know if you want to see me build an entire custom Ork army.